Supreme peace, blessings, and harmony, family. Welcome to this episode of Fundamental Vibes with Imhotep DaGreat. I am Imhotep DaGreat, and tonight we're going to go into the Indian slave trade. And that's just not the Indian slave trade, but the whole American slave trade. That's what we want to get into. We really want to drill down the point that the indigenous people, or the so-called what they may say, natives, the people who was here before anybody, was the first people that was enslaved. So we want to really drill that down, and also not just talking about the Indian slavery, but really talking about the slavery of America as a whole, because all different ethnicities and all different peoples was enslaved, as we're going to talk about tonight. Even when we're talking about the slave laws of Pennsylvania, we're going to go into it and we're going to get on it, talking about just slavery in general. As you can see, the title: American Slavery, Indian Slaves, White Slaves, and Negro Slaves. And we're going to start there, because when we talk about slavery, if you don't know, slavery is still going on today. If you don't know, you know, slavery is still going on today. It's just is under the term of, you guys going to see what I'm typing in. Is on under this term, but it's still going on because people make millions of dollars off slavery. And it's important to talk about this topic in the context of indigenous history, and us telling you, or just people who's teaching to let you know and find out the truth, that we are really from the Americas. We are not Africans, we are Americans. But it's important also in the context of being American and living in the United States, and understand that under this current administration, the current Biden administration, over 150 kids are undocumented. They don't know where they're at, and a lot of them has been sold to sponsors, so quote unquote sponsors. But that's not what this live is about. But we just want to understand that this institution of money making, of enslaving people, is an institution, is a legal institution, constituted by, or given permission by, the Roman Catholic Church or the Pope. So this is, in their eyes, illegal documentation. I will state and be clear that no man has the right to enslave no one else and deprive them from life. So whatever decree they made is inaccurate, and is a treason against the universe and all people of the universe. But we're going to get into it, though. We're going to talk about that as well. But again, what you see on your screen right now is the slave codes, or the just laws in Pennsylvania regarding slaves. So I'm going to read this article to you guys about just what was going on in Pennsylvania regarding slavery. Pennsylvania at time came to have three classes of slaves: first, Indian slaves; second, white bondservants; and third, Negro slaves. The first class we would naturally not expect to find in a colony found by Penn, who held the rights of the red man so sacred. In 1705, the legislature passed a law to prevent the importation of Indian slaves. They were brought into the colony from the Carolinas and other colonies. No Pennsylvania Indians were enslaved. Some of the leading men of the province had Indian slaves, and the practice did not cease to exist until the Act of 1705 was supplemented by other and more stringent laws. Indian slaves were held to be dangerous. For that reason, Massachusetts, the Carolinas, and other colonies sold most of the Indians captured in the war to the West Indies. Now we're going to break that down. The thing, again, as y'all seen in the title of the video, the first thing this article said: Pennsylvania in time came to have three classes of slaves. First, Indian slaves. So that will be natural. And we're going to go in our next thing. I'm going to show you why it first will be Indian slaves, just coming from the Pope. Let's just put it all together. We're going to connect the dots by documentation. So why the Indians was enslaved first is just naturally, if you think about it, anybody who's going on the thing of imperialism to expand their empire, to expand somebody's empire, they gotta enslave the indigenous people first. Let me ask you this: can someone come knock on your door and say, hey, this is my house now, and you're not going to go down without a fight? You're at least going to call the cops or something. So that's the thing when we get out the fantasy world. The first people they enslaved were the indigenous people. Let's be clear about that. The first people that they enslaved were the indigenous people. As what was going on in Pennsylvania tells you. Now, the second is the white bondservant. When we telling you white people were enslaved, the Slavics, the people of Europe, we're going to go deep into this on the next episode of this particular series. We're going to do this series in 3 series, talking about the Indian slaves, the white bondservants, and the next slave we're going to go into that was going on in America. But the white bondservants is definitely what we're going to touch on, because it's all divide and conquer. It's all divide and conquer. That's all they got going on is divide and conquer. It is an illusion. White supremacy is an illusion. It is basically giving them a couple privileges, giving white people a couple privileges to take over the indigenous people. So in Europe, they had the whole caste system, and not really a caste system, a class system, excuse me. They had a whole class system going on where only a few people had wealth and the rest of the common folks didn't have it. The kings, the knights, and all of them had that. So when we talk about the white bond servants who was coming from Europe, starting from when they first came over here in the 1500s, all the way up until the 1900s, they are steady bringing what their lower classes of whites. Now, this play that they did, as far as bringing the lowest class of whites, they did it in Australia too. But also, let's be clear, these whites was getting kidnapped. And white people were being enslaved by people who looked like them, other pale-faced people, and they also were being enslaved by darker complected people. You can say even some of our ancestors. This is just true for history, people, because what actually was going on in Europe, a war between the Moors and the Jews, the melanated Moors and Jews, the true Moors and Jews, versus the lighter-skinned nations or the Christian nations, the Eastern Europeans and the Mongols. So it was a lot going on. They were even enslaving so-called Slavic or white people. So when we're going to get deep into that, we talk about these 3 classes of slave, and it's important to understand that, because white people need to understand this, because they only gave them white supremacy to have them ignore the fact of the class system. It's still a class system. You know what I'm saying? They made the whole race thing, white people, black people, put people on their colors, which is a caste system. They made it to divide and conquer. We're going to get deeper in that. And again, the next category of slaves, according to Pennsylvania, is going to be the Negro slaves. Now, the Negro slaves, again, we telling you about the war was going across the Atlantic, how the Sephardic Jews and the Moors and all these different melanated people of Europe were being evicted, and they had to get the fuck on. The Roman Catholic Church said, we're going to do things our way. We're going to do it this way, and this is how things go. And it was just a fight for power what was going over there, what they're just not expanding on in history. Understand, melanated people not necessarily ruled, but they were the guiders, they was the teachers, they were the traders, they was the spiritual apex over in Europe, North Africa, and Asia. Melanated people who had came from the Americas, but have been in Europe for thousands of years. So you can definitely say they were the Europeans. And among also some of these melanated people, some of these people were from Africa too. So at the same time, it's a lot what was going on over in Europe that they're not telling. Europe actually was the first America. It was a multi-ethnic and multi-racial country or continent. It was a lot of different cultures there. So when you talk about the Negro slaves is going to be these Moors and these Sephardic Jews. We're going to show you that they was the first slaves, started with the Spanish Empire, starting with the Inquisitions, when they were over there taking the melanated people land. So all this slavery stuff, especially when we talk about the Indian slaves and the Negro slaves, those two for sure started with this right here, the doctrine of discovery. And I just want to touch on y'all what the doctrine of discovery was. The Papal Bull, or the Intercatere, issued by Pope Alexander VI on May 4, 1493, played a central role in the Spanish conquest of the New World. The document supported Spain's strategy to ensure its exclusive rights to the lands discovered by Columbus the previous year. It established a demarcation line 100 leagues west of the Azores and Cape Verde Islands and assigned Spain the exclusive rights to acquire territorial possessions and to trade in all lands west of that line. All others were forbidden to approach the lands west of the line without special license from the rulers of Spain. So basically, they just came and ran somebody's stuff and declared it, but the Pope gave them, through the Intercatera of the Papa Bull, which is just a doctrine, or in their world, a legal doctrine, to go over there and conquer. This effectively gave Spain a monopoly on the lands in the New World. Now, listen to what I'm finna say next, or what we finna read. The bull stated that any land not inhabited by Christians were available to be discovered. How you gonna discover something that people live on? Claimed and exploited by Christian rulers, and declared that the Catholic faith and the Christian religion be exalted and be everywhere increased and spread, that the heath of souls be cared for, and that the barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. The doctrine of discovery became the basis of all European claims in America, as well as the foundation for the United States Western expansion. So them starting on the coast of the Appalachian Mountains, and it was a time that they couldn't come past the Appalachian Mountains, the colonizers, or the people who was coming over here from Europe. But they had something called manifest destiny. They wanted to expand the territory of what you call the United States all the way to what they have it today, over to California or the Pacific Ocean. So that whole doctrine of discovery thing gave them that upper leg in their minds. Again, imperialism is no such thing. You can't take, you're a robber, you're a thief. You can't take something somebody already lives on. But the Papa Bull or the Pope gave them permission for this. And understand, people, when you're talking about reparations, you're talking about from that party too. Okay, again, the Catholic faith and the Christian religion be exalted and be everywhere increased and spread, that the heap of souls be cared for, and that barbarous nation be overthrown and brought to faith itself. This doctrine of discovery became the basis of all European claims in the Americas, as well as the foundation for the United States Western expansion. In the U.S. Supreme Court in the 1823 case Johnson versus McIntosh, Chief Justice John Marshall opinion in the unanimous decision held that the principle of discovery gave European nations an absolute right to New World lands, coming from the Pope. In essence, American Indians only had a right of occupancy, which could be abolished. And that abolishment was called extinguishment of the Indian title. We're not going to go there, but that's important for me to know. Only way they could really truly abolish it was to extinguish the Indian title. The way they extinguished that was reclassifying you to Negroes, blacks, and coloreds. You know, that's how they extinguished the title for real. But the doctrine, I just want to show y'all. Now, this Indian slavery that Pennsylvania is talking about started with the Papa Bull. We're going to go deeper into Papa Bull's times when we do talk about Indian slavery, but I want to be clear that the Pope gave them in 1493 permission. It actually goes back to 1455 when Pope Nicholas actually issued the grant, the first Papa Bull for the doctrine of discovery. 1493 they reaffirmed it after Christopher Columbus had, quote unquote, came to the New World with a Hebrew interpreter with him. Wake up, people. He came to the Christopher Columbus, got permission to come to the New World. He was looking for India. We ain't gonna get all deep into that right now either, but understand he brought a Hebrew interpreter with him. But this mission he came on was commissioned by the Roman Catholic Church, again starting in 1455, but doubling down in 1493. Now, we want to get into this article too. The widening of Euro-Americans, a divide and conquer strategy. Again, we want to show y'all that It's important when we talk about the three classes of slaves, because it's the same shit that's going on today. Everybody talking about they can't pay their bills. Everybody talking about it's classism, y'all. Now, classism is different, severe for so-called Black Americans, because you have the part of the caste system where your oppression is up front. Your oppression is in your face. White bond servers oppression, who you call white people today, oppression is more subtly, because it's a mind fuck. They have built these people a whole history to justify racism, but only thing they just gave they slaves from Europe who they never gave a fuck about. All they did is start giving them a little pieces of property here and there so they can forget they was a slave. You understand that? So we're gonna get into that. It's important when you talk about all three of these people. Even to today, it was divide and conquer for the elite to do. So we're going to get into this article right here. The widening of Euro-Americans, a divide and conquer strategy. In 1670, the Virginia Assembly, comprising some of the colony's most successful and powerful men, forbade free Negroes and Indians to own Christians. That is to say, white servants. Keep understanding, y'all going to keep saying this thing, white servants. It's just indentured servitude. For racism to work, they have to hide the fact that white people were slaves. You know what I'm saying? They have to hide that. So they gave them a fancy name. Instead of calling it slaves, they call it indentured servitude. Y'all see that? In 1676, the assembly made it legal to enslave Indians. They made it legal to enslave Indians. In 1676, the assembly made it legal to enslave Indians. From 1680 on, white Christians were free to give any Negro or other slave who dared to lift his hand in opposition to a Christian 30 lashes on the bare back. In 1705, masters were forbidden to whip a Christian white servant naked. What? A Christian white servant naked? Let's read that again. In 1705, masters were forbidden to whip a Christian white servant naked. Oh, they was whipping the white boy ass too. Nakedness was for brutes, the uncivil, the non-Christians. That same year, all property, horses, cattle, and hogs was confiscated from slaves and sold by church wardens for the benefit of poor whites. By means of such acts, the tobacco planters and ruling elite of Virginia raised the legal status of lower class whites relative to that of Negroes and Indians, whether free, servant, or slaves. Now remember, the Negroes are the Moors and the Jews, and they're going to soon become free people of color. They're coming from all across the world who already been denationalized through the Spanish Inquisition. This war that was going on across the Atlantic Ocean. The Indians is other melanated, just the Americans, the copper-colored races. And let's read this definition. American, a Native America, originally applied to the Aboriginals or copper-colored races found here by the Europeans, but now applied to the descendants of Europeans born in America. So when we talk about Indians, we're talking about us. When your grandma was talking about you was an Indian, the Cherokees, the Choctaw, I had Blackfoot in me, we were the Indians. The Negroes and the Indians mixed in together, but the balance always gonna weigh in the Indian favor. So if you talking about you came from Africa, you came somewhere in the world, now you're under indigenous, if you under so-called Black America, you have people when they do their genealogy, they're finding European, melanated Europeans in their genealogy, because this is actual history. They was kicking them out of Europe. But the Indians, again, is the copper-colored people found here, copper-colored races, brown. Remember, black is the caste system. We're not black. If you look at us, we go from really dark brown all the way to light brown. That's copper-colored races, different shades of copper. Found here by the Europeans. Found here by who the Pope gave permission to come over here and conquer. And let's remember in this gave them to conquer to make them perpetual slaves. I want to mention that. This is to make them perpetual slaves. This is to make them perpetual slaves, to make them slaves forever. That's what perpetual means, forever. So when you talking about putting the caste system, you talking about the Democratic Party, Republican Party, people, it's deeper than this, people. They got your land. And they think is by this doctrine of discovery is to make you a perpetual slave, make you a slave forever. And again, we're gonna go deeper into that, but we just gotta understand when you talking about Indians, you talking about the copper colored races.